Okay, we should be live now. Welcome everybody to another game design chat here on the Game Wisdom channel. I'm of course Josh Blaser, and joining me for our chat as always is game developer Tomo Moriwaki. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Happy to be here.
Oh yes, it seems every time we have these design discussions, the world around us is going crazy.
Seriously. Uh, I don't think. I mean, these are. It's the variety and the intensity of global events. I mean, I don't think I've seen this in my life. This is
Hmm.
we're in intensely noteworthy times.
Oh yes, and as Thorne is saying, it looks like they've officially announced that there's a PS5 announcement today as well. So
It's about. That's good to hear. Cool.
everything is just happening at once. 2020 is just reckless fire. Yeah. And I have two books to write by the end of the year as well. So this should be a very 2020 is not going to go out quietly, is it?
Well, I'm a big fan of science YouTube videos, and one that I saw recently, which just really captured my imagination and kind of set a lot of thought experiments going, was one that talks about the logistical map formula. It's a mathematic formula from which most of the chaos theory stuff comes from. And one of the neat features of it, I won't get into too much detail, is that when there's too much expansion or there's too much growth or the rate of growth gets higher, and as it gets higher and higher, it becomes unstable. Kind of in the same way that if you were to turn on a faucet of water, water will stream out. But if you increase the rate of water going out of it, it'll start to get disrupted, right? There'll be turbulence basically. And so if we were to think about something like a Kurzweil theory, like a singularity, that things will be happening faster and faster and faster and faster, you could basically imagine that the whole world is basically going through speed wobbles right now
Oh boy.
because of just all the stuff that's going on.
Mm-hmm. Oh yes. And we are all set for our very popular topic for, I guess, Tomo and I to talk about tonight for game design. And that is loot generation and design. This is something that I think PC gamers for probably now 30 years or a little bit around there have been loving in terms of their games.
I think it's totally fair to use the phrase time immemorial at that point.
Hmm. Oh, yes. Since
I think
PC.
that.
Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, since PC games been around, what, since like 1700? As I think Rock, Paper, Shotgun
Exactly.
said once.
Exactly. Now, it in some ways it doesn't matter how long the soul of the video gamer has existed because loot has always been a part of it.
Hmm.
I think before there was actually loot, there was the kind of like, think of score or points in an old arcade game of some sort.
Hmm.
That's just the value that we use to create loot, right? It's the proto loot.
Hmm.
It's like the stuff they want to talk about in what's that alien movie that I'm forgetting now because I was frustrated with not liking it.
Was it Prometheus?
Prometheus. There we go.
I didn't even see the movie. I just know it by what people have said about it.
I mean, it's actually a really interesting movie, but it I don't want to give broadcast too many of my unpopular opinions, but in much the same way that the last Star Wars movie had maybe a bit too many kind of ridiculous scale of magnitude choices,
Hmm.
I think Prometheus has some really silly things in it that really hard not to call dumb.
Hmm.
But the ideas are super cool and interesting.
And I guess super cool and interesting is another really good segue for loot design. So, like for myself, I've been playing ARPG since the original Diablo, Grim Dawn, Path of Exile, Borderlands, you name it. And for you, Tomo, what are some of your favorites of the ARPG genre?
Well, if I wanted to kind of start at the beginning, I'd have to say like those Wizardry and Might and Magic games were
Hmm.
probably where it started for me. Um, and then, of course, um, first Wasteland is probably another one that kind of gets in there. Probably to a much lesser extent, some of the JRPGs of the time because they didn't They didn't get into the insanity of loot. It's just took advantage of the fact that we all like collecting stuff. But I would say it didn't kind of reach like the kind of fever pitch until kind of the more modern era, where I could be playing games like Grim Dawn and Warframe, Borderlands included, and really these kind of, well, Diablo 2 of course is the big setup, I guess. I almost forgot to mention that, right? That's the you think this is the only game that gives loot kind of moment in our player history, but then we went postmodern, and so many different games from different kinds of genres, right, started to explore sophisticated loot dropping as a form of gameplay.
We have not only just loot generation in terms of loot tables, there's now the whole idea of loot boxes, this idea that, even something like Call of Duty or Battlefield, that all of a sudden after a match you get a giant box from the sky that reveals a new gun or a new item or anything along those lines. And I think it really is kind of like these two very different aspects of loot design. You have, procedural loot, Diablo, Grim Dawn, etc. And then you have this idea of, fixed loot, but kind of randomly given with loot boxes. There's this game I think Lost Planet 2 did something like that, where every time you beat a level, you got like a slot machine. This was before gambling was evil in the game industry, people. For those of you watching us right now, this was a happier time. And then when the slot machine finished, it would give you a weapon, an armor upgrade, or whatever.
Yeah. I really we can't overlook World of Warcraft, right? Because in terms of fixed drops and randomization, that's got to be the one that the largest number of people have had exposure to. But I think you can also break it down in terms of random acquisition, or the acquisition of gear being enjoyable, and then on the flip side of it is what makes it enjoyable is all the things you can do with that gear, right? So in the kind of Grim Dawn model, which I really think takes it to the furthest degree probably of any game out there, while still kind of holding on to some semblance of kind of gameplay decision-making stability, in that think about how many stages you go through in Grim Dawn with respect to your interest or the way you think about what drops, right? At first it's clearly overwhelming. You're just like, okay, I'll just take what I think that one is better than this one, so I will equip it, and I'm happy to have gotten something better. And then that kind of gives way to some of the more looser stuff like, well, maybe I want to be tougher versus do more damage. And, this one stat, I like this stat because this stat makes my character better more than some of the other stats. And that could maybe that's a theory at that time, right? But then once you hit that, that's the kind of the pivot point, because after that it spills into insanity. It's like, well, maybe I need a set of gear for every type of resistance. I want one set of gear that has the most broad resistance to all these things, as well as making me powerful for my particular build, for my kind of general wandering around. But for some bosses, I need to have a suit that's going to clamp me like, multiple levels of over resistance for a particular element, because that boss is very dangerous in that particular way. And next thing you know, the whole game, you see, like, it's almost like you play the whole game increasing this kind of imagination of what loot is there for, until it reaches like its critical mass, right? And then the whole game flips 180 degrees, and now you see the whole game through the lens of all the gear. And then by the time you get back to the to where you started, every boss, every region, every enemy, every build has an entirely different view of every single piece of gear in the entire game. And I mean, I guess I don't know if I feel good about that. I just know that I do it.
Yeah. And while I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to try and multitask. As Shar remind me, I have a separate overlay for these interviews. I'm going to try and set things up and chat at the same time. So this should go completely horribly for both accounts. Nice. We'll see.
While you do that, then maybe I'll get into just a tiny bit more detail what I mean about acquisition versus application, we'll say. I'm going to type that down. So acquisition is very much the loot box, the kind of the simple side of things, right? The human nature, surface human nature relationship we have with basically, really, it's getting any feedback whatsoever, right? Positive or negative reinforcement kind of fits into this, and something attached to it is that us humans can't help, and I'm not going to say we like or dislike, right? We can't help but be attracted to uncertainty. When there is an unanswered question, our brains like a bunch of flies to poo, right? Just start sticking around its edges and buzz around it and crawl all over it. The fact that we can't help it, and I think that's important, is part of why this becomes both a conversation about how good things can be, and in different circumstances become a conversation about how bad things can be, right? Because how we respond to our human nature is kind of up to us in the moment. But the idea, right? If we didn't have the idea of gambling addiction, if we didn't think about the concepts of exploiting a potential user, and that's its own conversation, and it's a very big one, honestly. Um, then a loot box is just like, well, we don't know what we're gonna get. Isn't that exciting? Let's see what we're gonna get. That feels so good. I love the idea of figuring out or turning my uncertainty into certainty. And all I got to do is open the box. I'm so
Yeah.
in. There's
Yeah.
this like that starting point. Depending and for us gamers that have really enjoyed this for so many decades, really at this point, that's the beautiful starting point for this entire chain of events. And of course, the value of what I get, or what I could get, or what I imagine I can get, and my excitement about that imagination cannot exist without my understanding of the system of how I apply or use whatever could be coming out of those boxes. And so that's why sometimes you'll see games like that have like a very simplistic, fun kind of gambling mechanic, and there's something enjoyable about that. But without the depth to back it up, people can't play it as long, because there just isn't as much stuff, thinking material to go through. And a game like Grim Dawn or Path of the Exile, Diablo 2, still maybe more so than Diablo 3, unfortunately. But Diablo 3 getting better and better, especially with the kind of the season structure that it kind of implemented at some point, and the pitching of the real money auction house. It's create enough there for us to think about. I was playing a lot of Borderlands recently, and this idea that I didn't do this with Borderlands 2 or Borderlands 1, but this idea that you'd go back through the game and start farming bosses for particular pieces of gear and start stair-stepping your way into this, the mayhem, the 10 levels of mayhem, and that you'd be puzzle-solving your way to kind of upgrade yourself through all these outrageous increases in difficulty. That's a great system for me to try to like learn more detail about the loot out there, and then also gain experience playing the bosses over and over again. Suddenly my ability to beat a particular boss gains like all this clarity. Like, I'm making choices, I'm optimizing my gear, I'm looking for gear in other places so that I can do this boss fight quicker, so that I can do it 30 times, so that I can feel like I have a reasonable chance of getting that one piece of gear that I want. Fantastic, right? Of course, the Borderlands 3 model does break down once you get one of those yellow cakes, and then you realize it just kills everything. And then that's kind of a tragic imbalance in what is otherwise kind of a neat system. And it's more meaningful, like, because it's an action game and its skill is required, and that certain intersections of skill and mechanic can create exponential results. This imbalance connives to destroy all the fine tuning that was done for all the other weapons leading up to this point, right? It's an unpleasant accident in an action system, which also happens in Warframe, by the way, which I think I have more than 1,000 hours into Warframe over the course of the years, although probably at the same number in World of Tanks. Have you gotten that overlay going?
I am trying it as quickly as I can. I think.
No, I don't mind monologuing.
Oh yeah, any of us can just talk and rant for hours on. Let me see if this is the latest one that Shark sent me. If this one doesn't do it, then I think I won't be able to set this up. Let's see. Now the latest version of it is still kind of, it's not properly scaling right.
Yeah, I think for my dev streams, I recently just made use of Memage, our lead coder. He was kind of more into and kind of knew Twitch better. Oh, look at that! I like the way that looks. Although you have to find my screen coordinates to get my face back up there.
And if I leave it like this, it'll still be kind of like a black bars all around. Though that's the only problem.
Well, my experience with OBS, you could put each of those frames and their camera feed
Hmm.
in on each of their own line items, and you can just click the eyeballs and then hide them.
Yeah, the problem is that the frame doesn't seem to want to stretch to cover the whole thing. Let's see. Because I can just copy and paste. Where was it? I can just copy and paste like your camera or the Discord window right here and put you in like this. It won't look, I think. Let's see, put you down here. Like for some reason, it does not want to. I have no idea why. There's a hole here for like a logo or something. We just don't have a logo there. Oh, I can go like this and see how it. And then I just need YouTube chat, and then that takes care of all the basics. Always the fun of doing these things
Look at
at
that,
the
that's
time.
working. Hey, Mr. Elrude actually makes a pretty good comment. Goes,
Hmm.
with Borderlands OP weapons, it may also be this. Quotes, well, we don't have any more content to offer forwards, so here, take this and have some fun. And I think that would be, like I ended up playing Borderlands in more recent times, but it's really just this like revenge of the cartels content, right? That probably resulted in all this imbalance because it seems like all these overpowered weapons come from that. Um, if there's nothing more to do in the game, says Mr. Elroot, having some OP fun for the end is not the worst idea. And I very much agree with that statement, actually.
Hmm.
In fact, sometimes I know there are a number of developers out there that are kind of very much more disciplined about this. Like they're never going to give you a free pass. And it makes me sad because even years later, when you've not had a free pass forever and the game's kind of in its sunset, that it would be a real nice move, right, to give all the committed players over the course of all these years just a free for all bit of insanity as a way to go, as a way to fly up to the sun, get and flame out.
Hmm.
But an interesting point comes up though is often as a developer, one of the most important thoughts that is kind of constantly going through my mind is uh, hours spent by developers versus impact made. And so that in this case, right, one of the things that making available basically the moment you finish the game, let's say, finish the story of Borderlands 3, weapons become available that can invalidate a progression path that may very well be an interesting experience for players.
Hmm.
Um, and so that what that does is it reduces the impact made of some of those hours spent, because it's like as a player, I'm sure there's like this like 75% of the weapons are uninteresting because from a practical standpoint they just don't put enemies down the same
Hmm.
way as the other 25% do. But that's not the way the developers thought about it. I mean, there might be a handful of throwaway weapons here or there, and I know in the context of Borderlands, there are a number of their legendary weapons which are really just very much copies of the purple weapons with some fixed bonuses added, right? And those weapons are not nearly as interesting as some of the ones that have these particular and special and quite overpowered
Hmm.
features to them, which allow you to basically take very powerful enemies and obliterate them in a time frame sometimes like in a tenth of the time as the other weapon would become, right? And
Yeah.
then in the context of this very significant ramping of difficulty through the mayhem levels, those older weapons now will take hundreds of times longer to take enemies down, whereas the overpowered weapons will only take 10 times longer.
Yeah.
Um, it's a and I'm not criticizing Gearbox in this regard. This is actually an extremely complicated space to be trying to deliver the experience and manage all the different types of users and make sure that they all have a minimum level of fun and that there is actually a legitimate kind of highest level of fun that they can all have.
Yeah. And yeah, there's definitely like a lot about, like, to Mr. Edwards' point as well, about how far do you go with your weapon or with your loot design. And this is something that we see again in more procedurally based games. And something like Battlefield, Call of Duty, those are all fixed drops. Those have been handmade, down to the decimal point. But when we talk about from an ARPG perspective, you never know what's going to drop. And as a developer, you never know exactly what's going to drop either, because loot generation, of course, is going to slightly randomize those stats. And like with something like with Borderlands, or just with the RPGs in particular, there's always that issue of, how do you balance your game around the fact that you don't know what the player is going to have. Like, we've all had those runs in an ARPG where we get a lucky legendary drop or an epic drop, and 10 levels of content are now meaningless because I have the super powerful weapon. Just as I could go 10, 15 levels, not get a single upgrade, and be struggling for that time.
I like it when I can get those 10 levels of upgrade. I love that. What I don't like is I get the item and I never ever swap that item out ever again. That's very sad.
And like with Borderlands in particular, I guess, did you run into this issue as well? That as you got further up, especially if you try to attempt like the New Game Plus stuff, that your options became very limited in terms of what weapons actually mattered to you.
Well, at first, it was all pretty cool because I didn't have any of those overpowered weapons and I was just trying things out. I was on Mayhem 1. I'm like, oh, wow, I really got to play. Because by the end of the story, generally speaking, you're kind of just tearing stuff up. And certainly the bosses maybe take a little bit of time, but it's not terribly difficult. And then you're faced with that choice, right? The true Vault Hunter mode versus exploring the Mayhem levels. And the Mayhem levels are far more noticeable, right? Because it's a sudden, dramatic increase in the hit points and the power of the enemies, and that really puts your weapons to the test. And then I cycled through all my weapons and found that few of them were better than others, and then tried to use those, struggled like crazy, and then hit the internet, and then started looking for the drops of various types, what weapons, kind of the good class of legendaries, and then in that process also discover what the super good class of items are, and then kind of tried to just play it straight for a little bit out to about Mayhem 3, and then made a more concerted effort and struggled like crazy to get some of those overpowered weapons, and then boom, just like 5, 6, 7, 8 Mayhem.
Yeah.
And then shortly after that, 9 and 10 Mayhem, and then complete the progression. Done.
Yeah. And that kind of is how I played a Diablo 3. You start very slowly at Torment 1, it's killing you. You do your first greater riff, get those gems, get the ancient variants. Once you get your build set complete, then you just, ratchet up the Torment, we're 5, 6, 7. And for me, I think, and I want to say you as well as the chat this, like, for me, that's when these games just tend to just stop being interesting for me. That when the loot chase is essentially done, at this point, I know what I need. Anything else is not going to work because, again, it's build dependent. And I just feel like I'm just chasing, maybe like 200 points of damage, maybe another 500 points of health. But again, we're at the point where I'm doing, several thousand points of damage. It just doesn't feel as satisfying as when I'm building the character and kind of trying to, get all the parts in alignment at that point.
Yeah, I think that all of these kind of loot experiences tend to run into that, right? Because obviously, all the people that make these games play all the other games that are like this. They have so many similarities. They're really, in some ways, kind of like, they're like the same math in so many ways, just modified for some of the specifics of the particular game. And I think that all of those pathways run into the kind of beginning of the kind of campaign experience that they have, where they go through the story, which is there to kind of establish my understanding of the systems. It's my first time through their progression structure. If there are skill points or there are traits or perks to be gathered up, that in that first playthrough, I go from not understanding their system to understanding their system. And at the end of that playthrough, I will develop a theory of what is good, and I'll act on it, right? And if the game allows me to act on it, that's usually better, because sometimes games, you have to go back through the game and start doing loot farming to just even create one of those theories, right? But in the context of, like, I'd say most of the games, you're like, oh, okay, I can improve my theory on this character's build, and I have
Mhm.
enough gear that I've collected up over the course of this that I understand what is optimal, and I can get a good result. Now, when that happens, unless the way they've handled their end game is kind of more sophisticated, and it's really sophisticated, by the way, because it needs to support every conceivable build, or at least all the
Mhm.
builds that matter, right? And how all the gear gets collected into those builds. But if it creates an interesting ramp of difficulty from that point, then it can keep going. And I think that was
Mhm.
one of the problems with Diablo, really, is that
Yeah.
it doesn't have a valid end game. It just keeps scaling. So you're
Yes.
just adding percent points, right? Whereas Grim Dawn, it's different. Grim Dawn, suddenly you have to collect all this resistance gear that you didn't even give a
Yes.
crap about. And I get it, that might feel kind of grindy. And if you're not up for it, then that's the good time to stop playing Grim Dawn. But if you
Mhm.
do jump into it and you do like collecting loot and you do like min-maxing things, there's like there's like another 100 hours of gameplay right there. And that's
Yeah.
only if you're going to explore like one or two more kind of like limited variants of your existing character understanding, right? You could add
Mhm.
hundreds more for every class that you want to dive into and
Mhm.
learn all the ins and outs of. And of course, it gets faster and faster because you don't have to do so much analysis of the content. Because that is, I think that's where most people break down, where I can't remember all the stats for 50 different bosses.
Yes. Oh yes. And for those of you watching who did not play Grim Dawn, you know what we're talking about. What they do is that when you play the game on normal difficulty, there is no kind of resistance. Like it's basically kept at zero when you start. So you have zero in all resistances. You can get gear, gives you more resistance to fire, ice, aether. You know, there's like 8 or 9 different things that can kill you in that game. And then when you go to the next difficulty, they give you an across the board, I think it's negative 25% resistance to all those stats. So now suddenly you are taking, I think it's 25% more damage from everything just by default. And then I think that goes up to 50% on the third difficulty. So what ends up happening is that if you're not building, if you don't have anything that gives you resistances, oh, did we lose the stream?
I'm here.
No, we're on. Oh, I think Thor may have got disconnected. Yeah, we're still on. Don't scare me like that. But what ends up happening, of course, is if you are not, excuse me, if you are not building anything defensive, you are going to get rocked when you go to a higher difficulty. And I want to build off what Tomo just said about scaling, because I think that's a very big point about kind of like the difference between, I think, amazing and not so amazing endgame design, these kinds of titles. Because, as we've said, loot, these kinds of loot focused games are about that chase. You are trying to find the next gun, the next sword, the next epic legendary, whatever. And those aspects have unique modifiers to them, or the better examples do. That's not just you get a shiny new sword, you get a shiny new sword that can, shoot fireballs, or you hit the enemy and like a meteor drops down. But you can only program so many of those in. And then what ends up happening, as we saw in Diablo 3, it just becomes a scale chase. Oh, you could kill enemies with 10,000 points of health, now kill them with 12,000 and 14,000. And just repeat that again and again, but you're still doing the same exact things. And I think that, to me, is when I kind of just, raise the white flag and say, all right, I'm done. It's time to move on to the next game.
Yeah, then you if we go back to Grim Dawn, because Grim Dawn really is, I mean, I think you can probably draw some competitive analogies with Paths of the Exile, but
Mm-hmm.
Grim Dawn is got to be my top pick for long-term loot
Mm-hmm.
gameplay structure. But then they start giving you items, right, that have these unique abilities, which suddenly make unexpected or new variations on your character builds viable. And then if you've gotten that far, suddenly you become very curious about trying them out.
Mm-hmm.
And now a single new piece of gear that they plant anywhere in the game suddenly that you maybe you read about or something on in an article or saw people talking about in a Discord channel, you want to give it a shot.
Mm-hmm.
And now you go out chasing it, and then you make your changes to your character, And then you kind of, if it's an interesting enough change, you kind of want to try it out on all kinds of stuff all of a sudden, and suddenly hours of new gameplay get revitalized, and you're back in the seat. But to do that, you need to create a system that allows for that kind of extraordinarily long-term scaling to not devolve into that super smooth micro progressions for too long a period. You need jumpy changes. You need things. My perspective of the game needs to change, and if it doesn't change by at least 5%, then maybe I won't even notice. But because I've been playing for 1,000 hours now, 5% change to the experience is humongous.
Yeah. And I mean, like, Diablo 3 to a point, I think, did that right. Like, would they kind of change? And I think this is another, like, very fascinating topic about loot design, is kind of like how you stretch out your different rarities, or, what kind of rarities you have. That they save the legendaries, or the set items for endgame. Like, I don't think they will drop until you hit level 70. And then those set items can basically rewrite a build. They can change aspects of it. I remember with my Crusader, I think one was like you get like infinite shield charges, or there's no no recovery time between shield charges. You can just be like dashing around the map like Sonic, just like crushing everything. But that is reserved for that set. If you don't have that set item, you're not doing it. And like you said, I like when things get like very spiky like that, when you get those very grand changes, but it kind of again goes back to you can only get that thrill once. Because once I've gotten my super fancy set done, where do I go from there?
Well, I think that's where a game's strategy of adding new content starts to come into play. And adding new content is by no means an easy thing to get right. I mean, it requires, like, you're always going to be stressed out by the people that are hardcore into the game, because they will complete the content faster than you are at all comfortable with, and their attitudes are going to be very different from the mainstream body of your users. So you're like, do we make them happy? What's the right thing to add for the mainstream, and how can I add something for the mainstream that the hardcore players can see as anything other than idiotic? And that it's kind of an impossible problem to solve, but we can definitely see how some games do better jobs of it than others. And even when done right, we can point to hundreds or thousands potentially of forum posts of angry players on either side of that coin. I mean, I think that there is easily a PhD dissertation worth of differences in approach just between like Borderlands and Destiny, for example.
Oh yes,
two completely different kind of ethoses to their approach to the way they modify or expand the gameplay experience over the course of many, many hours, right? And it's really hard to say who's making a better approach. It's really hard to imagine that one could take from the other, because they rely on these totally their own player patterns. I mean, you might want to imagine that Borderlands' approach might be a little more generic, and they're a little more like a direct analogy for your conventional ARPG. And I'm a big fan of both of these games. But what I do like about Destiny is that it takes such a unique approach to their loot progression that is 100% built from their actual game. Right, their classes, their class abilities, and the way weapons work, and the way how many weapons you can be carrying at any given time, the relationship of damage to certain things, and so forth. All of Destiny's choices are just Destiny's choices, which is really interesting to analyze. And Bungie is veteran, absolutely super smart and good about this stuff. So studying what they do is always worthwhile. And then on the flip side, you got Borderlands, and Borderlands like, yeah, but what about all the other stuff that they do with loot that we love? We're just going to do it, and we're going to make it work.
And I think there's a very interesting conversation right there about designing the loot as part of the class system, or the loot kind of being there to supplement the class. And what I mean by that is, if you look at something like Diablo, for instance, that the weapons themselves, outside of the set variety, they don't really correspond. They don't do anything to your builds. They're not really changing, how your zombies strike or how your laser beam as a sorceress goes off. Whereas it sounds like something like with Destiny, or even with one of my favorite games like Victor Vran, that the weapons themselves kind of become the class. Like if you're using a shotgun in Victor Vran, that is a different kind. You're going to be using different skills, and it's essentially going to be a different way of playing the game. Is if you're using a sword. The Warhammer Inquisitor Marta that I was playing a few weeks ago, I think I showed a few days on stream, they go with that same approach. That yes, you have this class, but whatever weapons that you have equipped, that is essentially how you fight, and one is completely different from the next.
Sorry, I was looking up Victor Vran on Steam. I haven't played it, but you mentioning it definitely gets me to take a closer look. Yeah, and that's the thing is like you have to make those choices when you create the system. This is probably a really good example of how a surface understanding of ARPG is not at all enough to make one. Right, those people like the Grim Dawn folks, they knew exactly what they were doing when they created what they created, and I'm assuming this Victor Vran game is probably very similar. Whereas you could take and I don't mean to denigrate, but the Van Helsing games, for example, are very much more like a kind of a straight copy, right? It's like we're gonna duplicate features and then we're gonna take a little twist at this little point with the way we use abilities. And the more you get into these games, the more you start seeing just how elaborate their structures are, and how one game will focus on class over weapon, one game will focus on set over line item bonus collections, right? Like you could take like Torchlight might be one of the best examples of right in the meaty middle. Right, doesn't do anything too weird or crazy, has lots of different systems that we've all seen in other games, and puts together in a candy-like, straightforward sort of way. Even the way they do set bonuses, right, is kind of a little bit looser than some of the other ones. But the crazier ones, if they get it right, we like those more for some reason, right? I think everyone can enjoy Torchlight 2, but very few ARPG fans would say it's their favorite ARPG, even if all of them have put a couple hundred hours into it.
Yeah, and I felt the same way. Like I play both Torchlight and Torchlight 2. I like them. Like nothing felt like I was not having fun with those experiences. But when I was finished, I was like, I don't want to go back to this game. Like it just kind of like that first time I played it, that was enough for me. Whereas with something like Grim Dawn or Titan Quest or Diablo, I mean, dear God, Diablo, I've made at least like 15, 20 different characters. Like every time there was a season, like when they were actually adding new stuff for the seasons, each season was a brand new character. That's how I basically play that game. And with Grim Dawn, I think I have, at this point, made a character with every possible No, I have not, because I added more with the last expansion, but I got close.
Yeah, and I think that's a sign that the system has certain unique approaches, right? And so some of these AR season is a legit new innovation, honestly, and it's something that I think more and more everybody should be doing, and we're seeing it happen, right? All the big games are going down this season path where there'll be specific things that are happening in that time frame that'll create a unique variety to the gameplay that you won't get at other times, and you need to buy into that like a kind of a light subscription of some sort.
Yeah, and again, like Path of Exile has been doing that, I think since like they officially went onto 1.0, that they'll have like a season or a ladder race and things like that. And yeah, it's definitely, and I think as you said, like there's a lot of potential there as a way of kind of getting around this issue of an endgame. That instead of having to chase gear, you're chasing other players for a set period of time. It kind of in a way like compartmentalizes, the ARPG core gameplay loop. That we're just
Yeah.
going to make it entirely focused on, fight, get loot, get stronger, get your character as high as you can go, get your reward, and now we're going to do it all again, but maybe with a variation. Maybe we lock a certain class, and like Path of Exile is such a fascinating game in terms of ARPG design. Again, like for those of you who don't remember, this was basically the game that said, "Hey, you hated Diablo 3? Come right here. We'll welcome you with open arms." And like Diablo's 3 failure at launch basically elevated Path of Exile up there into the stratosphere.
To be fair, I think they were just they thought that they could just rely on their name.
Mm-hmm.
They were going up against hard, like it's almost like they underestimated what they were going up against.
Mm-hmm.
And it was like Torchlight at that time, or Torchlight 2 even, right? And it was frustrating at first, because the game is absolutely beautiful, and it is still very smooth in its progression.
Yeah.
It only really fell apart in its end game, and that's because they took a more simplistic path, which since then they've done a lot of things to mitigate. The seasons, I think you can think of seasons almost in some regards as like creating kind of like a roguelike functionality in the context, right? This like little bubble of play that if I play here, I can spit out something useful forever, but really I'm going to explore this bubble in this time frame because of the changes to the content they make on a season by season basis.
Yeah.
Destiny does exactly the same thing. And it's like if I wasn't thinking about it, I'd just be like, well, I'm just chasing that cool item that I want to have before it becomes unavailable. And then you do 3 seasons and you're like, oh, wait a second, I'm getting kind of caught up in the differences every season. Oh, I understand now.
Yeah, I have not played Destiny. That's on my ever-expanding list of games at some point to play. And yet, it definitely seems like a way of getting around that, again, the limitations of long-term ARPG play. And...
Go ahead, no worries.
I was just going to say, going back to, some, Grim Dawn versus Diablo, Grim Dawn has done so much in terms of its itemization that, they just released a patch, I think, a week ago at the time of this recording, that completely rewrote their itemization again. And they're adding in a lot more to it. And, like you said a few minutes ago, this is not something for a novice game developer. That... just because you play Diablo or you play Grim Dawn doesn't mean you can instantly make the next Diablo or the next Grim Dawn. There's so much that goes on under the hood of these games to make them work properly.
And if you haven't been there with all those other users putting all those hours into these games, you're going to have a really hard time understanding what's a valid next step. Because you have to really understand, us as users, as people who've played multiple ARPGs and put hundreds of hours into multiple ARPGs. Right? Until you've gotten to that point, until you're one of those users, it's really hard to kind of see the lay of the land and make sense of what a next step could be that'll serve the needs of so many of those users. And it's tricky. It's and it's unfair in some ways, right? Because it's like, if you're not a part of the club, then you can't make something for the club.
Yeah.
But that's only the case for these really specialized segments or specialized genres, right? If you want to get in on the specialized genre, you need to spend the energy to specialize, basically.
Yeah. And I think to Thorne's point, kind of like the platformer genre, that it's easy to design a low quality one, but you really need to kind of get your hands dirty in that genre in order to understand what makes it work, what makes it doesn't, or what makes it don't. And when you don't have that, again, it's very easy to make those simple mistakes Like with Van Helsing, for instance, and as a very weird coincidence, the developer of the Incredible Adventures of Van Helsing went on to do Warhammer Morta, or Warhammer Inquisitor Morta, if I get the proper name right. And I see the same kind of issues with loot design. And this is a topic I don't think we've touched on yet with our discussion. When there's too much loot, and a lot of it just doesn't really matter. And I think there's definitely an art in terms of being able to properly give the player information as to what they're looking at. Because I have played, like I said, with Van Helsing and with Mortar, that I'll kill an enemy, I'll get like 10, 15 different pieces of gear drop, and I have no idea what the hell I'm looking at. Like, is this weapon better than this one? I don't know. This one does 15 fire damage. This one does 15 burning damage. I don't know. it just... There's this, like, art to getting that pacing right, that you want the player to kind of stop and think about their build, but at the same time, you don't want it to turn to like a 20-minute, I'm going to pour over my spreadsheet to figure out, okay, this weapon will give me a 2.6 increase in my overall stats.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's a lot of complexity, and I do think that Van Helsing, especially, what its strengths were the kind of focused on your ability use against enemies, right, and less of a focus on the sophisticated relationships that gear has with those abilities. And in some ways, it's good if the gameplay that they promote then is that the gear is less important than the specific choices you make with your abilities. And you can kind of see that in the way they handle their interface too. And I mean, I like that stuff. In fact, if we kind of go back to Destiny, and I'll only talk about it a bit because you haven't played it much, is it does this one thing with gear. It has these yellow items, which I think are called unique or exotic. The exotic category of gear, you can only equip one exotic weapon and one exotic armor. And exotic items always do an ability-related change to the class. And so between the choice of your exotic weapon and your exotic armor, you can kind of make like a subclass differentiation.
That's what I was thinking.
And you'll play a little different. And in the context of a shooter experience, that can become significant. It can very much change the pattern of your running and jumping and shooting and taking cover. Which is what I love about Destiny, is that I know that the developers are thinking out those lines, that they're very strongly in a very like even sort of way connecting the action controller experience with the loot choices. So I like that a lot. Now there are plenty of criticisms to make about Destiny. I know the kind of public discourse around Destiny, kind of there's some ups and downs, and there's I don't think that Bungie has the same attitudes about kind of like freedom of loot the way most of us users would prefer, right? They're always going to be stingier. They come from an older PC shooter background, right? Because if we think of like something like Warframe, on the other hand, they're not at all the same, right? They're like the more the merrier. Let's go absolutely crazy. Like they want you to understand all the good stuff you're getting, and they want to give you more loot. And then, of course, I guess like in the case of Inquisitor or Van Helsing, that it can't quite figure out if it's on one side or the other.
Yeah, and what you just described there in terms of the exotics sounds very fascinating, and I think that's something that really. It reminds you, again, going back to the whole set design that Diablo 3 wanted to do, but it's, from what you're describing, it sounds like it's a more elegant example of that instead of you needing 4 or 5 pieces of gear to kind of turn on that unique ability, they're just saying, you have a gun, you have an armor, each one does its own unique thing. And I think this goes back to what you were saying at the start while I was still in my fiddling the UI portion of, like, high-level ARPG play, or high-level like loot exploration, is about figuring out how do I build my version of this class. Like using like really good gear that can kind of supplement or enhance your abilities can I think it can elevate these kinds of gameplay, but it's very hard, I feel, to get that balance right. Like, even with Grim Dawn, even with all the itemization they've done, it still doesn't feel like the gear is really changing how I play. Now, I just want to say one caveat to that. I have not really had a chance to look at too many of the super legendary items in Grim Dawn, so I don't know how that tier applies to your skills.
Yeah, no, it's well, I mean, I guess in the more conventional kind of ARPG or CRPG, depending on which of those categorizations you want to use, Grim Dawn has those abilities modify like the spells that you cast or the output of the buttons that you press. And you know, your normal kind of click a location and hit buttons, kind of like, you know, we could say like WoW style play. It rarely gets to the level of really changing the way I approach or my lead up to click a bad guy and click a button to do something to him. Other than maybe I'll stay further or closer. Whereas the shooters, they don't have that luxury, right? They don't have the room to create that complexity. You are moving, you are shooting, you are taking cover, you're getting line of sight. Your range matters quite a bit. I think that there's kind of a reason why you're going to see more elegant solutions on the action side.
Yeah.
And more focus on the potential variation that's already there in the RPG side.
Yeah, man, I think that's a really good point. Again, it's that difference between what the foundation of the game is and how that relates to loot. Like, with something like Diablo, what they did was they built all the kind of unique elements into the class skills themselves. So each class behaves completely differently. You know, they have a different resource, their skills work at a different kind of ability. But none of that is related to your gear. You know, a barbarian with a two-handed axe is the same as a barbarian with a two-handed sword, or a sword and a shield, or anything like that. Whereas, as you said, like with something that's more action-focused, where it is more about kind of putting the weapon in the player's hands, you can get a lot more variety. Like with something like the Division or Destiny, that there is a difference shooting a guy with a shotgun than there is with a sniper rifle, or an assault rifle, or whatever other weapons you have.
You know, something interesting about that too, by the way, is like sniper versus submachine gun. Let's say we're just going to take that isolated difference, right? If you like submachine guns, you can watch videos of those players, right? And they're 100% different than those sniper players. Sniper players, like, you see them enter a large area and then they'll stop and they'll scan a bit and then they'll, with intent, move to a location. And then they're gonna, and then they're gonna start killing things. And if it doesn't quite meet their needs, they'll stop a bit, look around, and move to a different location. That submachine gun player's like, time to get dirty.
Yeah, he's running there. Yeah. And I guess, did you play either Division game, Tomo?
A little bit, yeah.
What did you think of the Division? Like, either from a loot design or just like a general like gameplay loop perspective?
Well, I feel like it's an interesting evolution of that kind of like Vegas style gameplay that they had kind of mastered, really. And I always found like I never really felt like I connected with the loot like situation for them. I just kind of would follow along because I was always so much more fixated, because of the Tom Clancy kind of edge, on the role that you play and trying to get the most out of that role and those play styles. So I never really, I don't think I really thought about it as much, right? Like you saying it, I recognize what you're saying, but I never felt it in my explorations of their gameplay, because it was always so, SWAT team or military squad role focused. Can I do my role better? And I never really opened my mind up to kind of seeing it the same way. Maybe I see games like Borderlands and Destiny.
Yeah, and like for me with Division, I think it ran into I guess like a similar problem I had with Borderlands, that when you get to the end game, the weapons themselves again don't really change what you're doing. Like once you get that one good pistol or that one good assault rifle, that's it. You're just then chasing, a better version of that. Whereas again,
Yeah.
with what it sounds like with something like with Destiny, that or even with the basic gear hunt in Diablo 3, you are chasing something that is legitimately going to change how your character is going to behave going forward. And I
Well, I
think,
think you get some of that in Borderlands.
mhm,
Like my example being that when I did finally find that yellow cake, suddenly my entire strategy of playing became revolved around a heavy weapon. So now I could no longer get close to enemies, and because splash damage is so essential now, literally I jump all the time. Now I don't know if I like that, but it certainly changed the way I approach things.
mhm. So one thing that I wanted to bring up before I forget it again is kind of like how limiting or how much control should the developer have over the progression and or the loot chase. And here's what I mean by that. If you remember from Diablo 3, what they did, especially after patch 1.04, was a very much kind of curated the experience. Every level you beat, you get another skill. They have loot tables explicitly set up at specific level tiers. Like I said, ancient or legendary items don't even drop, or I'm sorry, set items don't drop until 70. Whereas something like with Grim Dawn, they've been doing, I think, a lot to kind of delineate all their cool stuff from beginning to end. Like very early on, you're going to get, I think, like the second highest rare version of your weapons. I think it's only until the end game, or I'm sorry, the end of like the normal version, do you see like the purple, ancient kind. And and again, like something like with Warhammer Inquisitor, they just basically say you must level up, or specific weapon types and gear will not drop at all. And like that to me felt the most constrained of an ARPG that I've ever played.
Well, yeah, I think that the developer needs to make choices on how to constrain the progression, and some are going to be better than others, and it'll depend on kind of the structure of your game. um, you know I think we can all recognize that that transition from kind of completing the story experience and ramping our way through the first level up of our first character, that when that ends there's always a bit of an awkward transition, because you kind of have to rearrange your approach to the game and start seeing it in a new way. Start seeing the whole breadth of all of its content as like a place to farm. Start seeing what that now you're not going to progress anymore. You no longer care about gaining experience points. You don't care about getting a new level. You're not going to get a new skill. You can reconfigure your skills at a cost maybe, but now everything starts focusing on, if I can get this percentage to 258 and get this percentage up to 150, that I can then try to make the type of sorcerer that can melt certain enemies at this high difficulty. I'm gonna try that out, and then I fill in my pieces, and if it works, I'm like, oh, that was great. Now, to go from leveling up to farming gear is kind of a, it's a I mean, is it ever not sucky? I don't know. I mean, now at this point, I've done it so many times that I'm used to it. So I just kind of don't think about its awkwardness. I mean, do you remember the first time you got to 60 if you played Vanilla WoW? And it's kind of a letdown, right? Because unless you can find a big old gang of people to play with, you can't do the stuff that's been unlocked. And so that idea you're never going to gain another level, which of course isn't true because the expansions will be coming out in the future, is sort of sad. And I think for myself, the first time that happened, the social interactions with the other people really helped out. But then once I got used to the way, once I learned the ropes, is just a transition, just like any from here's our think of the story and the first leveling up of your character as just that's the tutorial.
Yeah. Oh yeah, like I think like anyone who plays the RPGs know like your first character is always going to be your worst character because you're still just trying to put the game through its paces and try to figure out, you know, how do all this gear and the skills and all that kind of interlock with each other.
Oh my God, yeah. And like I'm sure we've all felt this, right? Where
Hmm.
you get to the end of the game and you had no idea that you were struggling really hard because your first set of choices were
Hmm.
really bad.
Oh yeah, like with Grim Dawn in particular, like the first few times I played that game, the final boss was always a terrifying moment for me because I was always dying at that fight. Like people who watch like streams of me on hardcore play, like you see my health like at 100%, and then like half a second later, we're down to like 10 points of health left just because my character wasn't built right. And then the last time I played it on stream, I was just basically, yeah, this boss is dead. Okay, we're done. Like it, just because of how much things have changed. And
When you learn to just
yes,
move some things around, right? And then it's like, boom, gone. You're like, what?
that was it. But that actually takes me to a very interesting point I want to ask you about because this is something that I was noticing. Onboarding players for ARPGs. I think this is a very fascinating part because, as you said, the search and the love of loot in these games, it is an old school approach. Like, again, like we've been playing RPGs for decades now. Like you, once you've played Diablo, it gets in your blood. Like you know when you play a new one, kind of the basics of it. But for a new player, somebody who is trying to get into these games for the first time, there is a lot that goes on under the hood that you're not going to comprehend simply by playing the game. And I remember when I was doing a multiplayer night with Mojo and Shark, and they were playing Grim Dawn for the first time, and they were struggling in terms of figuring out, what weapons do I equip? How do I know what skills are good? And stuff like
Oh
that.
yeah.
And
And you're
again,
like,
like, for
this game's
me,
kind of ugly.
yeah. Like, for me, this is just like, it's basically like breathing at this point. I know, okay, if I'm going for a fire build, I want fire. If I want ice, I want ice. These are the skills that complement that. 1, 2, 3, we're off to the races.
Yeah, and usually over the years I've come to learn what the messaging is from the developer. I'm like, hey, what is their basic kind of meathead, uh, will work effectively, but maybe not the fastest, maybe not the most optimal kind of build that they're trying to message I should follow, and I just go ahead and I follow that for the first level up. I used to try to be tricky and clever every game I played, and then every now and then it'd like literally stop me from playing some of them because it's like, oh, you pick some glass cannon and you will never get past that boss because you don't know what you're doing.
Oh, yes. Yeah, and like one of the big things kind of like I've shifted my perspective of ARPG design is going from making like jack of all trades characters to making like very build oriented characters where I'm not just building, a guy who does fire, ice, lightning, and all that. I'm just saying, okay, this is my fire stunlock character, and that is this character's life for the next 60, 70, 80 levels. I'm not going to get an ice skill just to have it. I'm going to build this specific role. And it has changed a lot of how I approach ARPGs these days.
Yeah, I hear you. I mean, well, that's the thing too. Is like, it's a sure sign that it's a great genre that we could pump hundreds of hours into dozens of games and still be evolving our perspective on how we approach them. It's also a testament to the quality of the developers, and that, like with the shooter or the action loot experiences, it gives us pathways, like valid pathways that like reach into details that we've been cultivating for many years, that we can jump into those games and have all this interesting satisfaction. Like someone could go from Grim Dawn having never played a first person shooter, and if they jump into Borderlands, I think they can enjoy it quite a bit. I mean, they'll have a lot of ramp up in learning in the basics of running around and shooting things directly, but they'll be very satisfied because they'll see kind of all these things that they were expecting happening in the loot collection experience.
Yeah. And I think to Highlander's point in chat, like Diablo 3, like say what you will. Again, we can complain about Diablo 3 and Blizzard till, no pun intended, the cows come home, or the hell cows. But I think they did a really great job of streamlining the ARPG for new players. One of my favorite things they did was they give you kind of the stat forecast that whenever you go equip a new item, it shows you, okay, it will enhance your attack attribute by this percent, it will lower your defense by this percent, it will raise your health by this percent, and you can look very quickly and decide, okay, good for me, doesn't help me, this is going to make me worse, sell those, keep what I want, move on.
Yeah. And I think that it's actually something this is a legitimate criticism basically of any developer that is like truly old school hardcore PC, is that they inevitably make information available that is misleading. And I'm not saying they ever do it on purpose. It just happens, right? Like, my God, if you look at all the information available to you in Grim Dawn, you're just like, really? Which of these numbers matters? This one literally says DPS, but this other approach seems to be way better. How is that possible?
Oh yeah, and Inquisitor has that same issue where even like the craziest thing is that their UI I think kind of sucks in this regard, that the actual value that shows you the DPS of a weapon is the blandest number on the info pane of that weapon. So you're looking at all these stats, and the stats don't tell you what that weapon does. It's like this very, very hard to see, this does 45 damage. But then you get these like modifiers are like, this one will give you a 10% chance if you do a burn attack to hurt your enemy for additional 2% more damage. I'm like, okay, I guess that's good.
Well, that problem is basically a natural side effect of any kind of complexity in gameplay choices. I think you see that in Borderlands, it's pretty severe, right? It's like you have no idea what the good weapons are going to be sometimes until you pull the trigger. Like you need to try, because the way it communicates effectiveness is that it doesn't really. And you get these weird guns that you just don't even understand how they're supposed to work, and you're like, oh, I didn't try the alternate fire. Oh, if I always use the alternate fire, this thing just melts bad guys. But I couldn't tell. And yeah, there was a lot of guns, and I didn't actually try it. Shoot, sorry. And you read on the internet that the gun that you hate is the best gun in the game or something. And you were super confused.
Yeah, and like Borderlands, I think, is another really good example, again, of how the weapons are kind of like the classes themselves in a way. Because again, a shotgun behaves differently than an assault rifle, and so on and so on. And like you said, like numbers don't, like, especially for like action focused games, a number doesn't really tell you how this weapon feels in your hands. And like you can have a sniper rifle that maybe with like 2% more reload speed or fire rate just feels completely different than all the other sniper rifles you've played. And like I've played like Borderlands, so I've gotten those guns that, when you get like the super slow ray of fire, it just kills like all your momentum, and then you get that super speedy pistol or shotgun, and like you said, like the submachine gun people, then it's just like I'm running around killing everything.
Well, if we wanted to, like, we take the three games of Warframe, Destiny, we'll just say Destiny 2, and Borderlands 3, right? We have three very different approaches to kind of a lot of the same topics. And they all have the same problems, though, right? In that you can't tell which weapons you're going to like. And it's partially because in an action setting, trying to convey all the complex details that go into making these guns perform, it might not be the right idea even to try to convey it necessarily, because no one will understand what you're trying to tell them. And to be fair, it's not like any of them do, right? They don't try to explain that if you liked the AWP in Counter-Strike, that you'll love this sniper rifle in Borderlands, or Warframe is trickier because you do all this constructing and modding of every single weapon in the game. And yeah, actually, Warframe is probably its own entire stream, huh?
Probably.
because it's disassembled gathering loot in a way that I don't think anyone else has really done. It's made collecting. My bold claim is that it's done something unique and insane with collection in an action context that no one else can even come close to yet.
Yeah. It is such a fascinating game to examine with Warframe. Let's see.
Oh, by the way, I am running short on time at this point, so
Okay.
if maybe we should move to kind of a recap and
Okay.
last set of points kind of state for the stream.
All right. Sounds good. And again, like, we can come back to this topic in a few weeks or next month whenever we have free time. We can certainly rant about loot generation and design for hours and hours.
When it's such an essential part of the gamer's soul, I think it is an evergreen topic.
Yeah. I'm trying to think if there's anything major. I guess here's one of this will be my final topic because it's one thing that we didn't discuss yet. I think it's kind of important, especially for developers or people watching, and the idea of how loot gets dropped. Because this I think goes back to psychology, as we said earlier, like loot boxes and gambling, that making the player or give the player that sense that something big or something wonderful is going to happen. And we've seen games kind of apply different ways of doing this. Diablo, for instance, when you see an elite pack of enemies, you know it's going to be a hard fight, but something shiny is going to drop when they're dead. Some games will have, a random treasure chest. Or even going back to Diablo 3 with the greater rifts, that when that rift is complete, the second that boss dies, the loot pinata appears. And it's very hard, I feel, to know, again, how much do you string the player along, and how often do you kind of, hit that release valve for new stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that actually harkens to just some basic human nature related things that we need to keep in mind, right? If I gave you a ton of stuff, if I gave you the most I can give you every 15 minutes, it's just simple math now. How many 15 minutes can you handle before you get sick of this? It's a done story, right? You're never going to get more than that because I gave you the maximum. And now it's just a simple matter of how many loops you can tolerate before you get bored. So now, that aside, the other one is I never give you a lot and you just feel unsatisfied, and at a certain point you just get tired and walk away. So those being two potential extremes, the question now becomes, what are rhythms that we can put in place that make people interested and keep them going? Can I go a little every 15 minutes I give you a little loot explosion. Every hour I give you one that's twice as big, and every 4 hours I give you one that's 4 times as big, let's say. And let's say I took my dynamic range and separated that out. Even that now is how many 4-hour loops can you handle before you get tired? And so now the question is, the thing to look out for, in my opinion, is what are the developers holding back and saving for certain infrequent moments?
Yes.
And is it too frequent for you, or is it not frequent enough? And then you can just at least you can tell yourself the nature, how you will feel when you're done playing this game.
Yeah, and speaking about infrequents, they just in the last patch for Grim Dawn, they now have bosses who will drop infrequent items or infrequent modifiers for items now. So they've done you can't really compare Grim Dawn 1.0 to where it is right now in terms of its itemization.
Huge difference, yeah. I mean, I'm expecting certain games. In fact, I think probably Destiny might be a good use case for something like this, and certainly would help Borderlands. A thing like they won't drop anything. They will drop from the good table only once per hour, or once per day, or once per week. And once it's done, we communicate to you. Your one good drop table roll is done. Stop this. Do not fight this boss 75 times in a row. You're on the crap. You're on the second rate loot table now, and then you move on to because since endgame is everything, they should message to us how they think or how they designed the game to be enjoyable for us. And it includes those kinds of messaging that are time sensitive, that relate to your rewards per gameplay relationship. And so I expect to see a lot of features like that happening. And I know some games like obviously the whole idea of like dungeon and raid lockouts in the context of MMOs have been doing that for ages, and I think that's a survival tactic because otherwise people leave. They're like, yeah, I got everything. I played for 94 hours straight. I lost my mind. I got everything, and now I will definitely never go back. You don't want that in your game.
Yeah, and like, as you're describing Destiny there, I'm just reminded of doing like dozens of ball runs in Diablo 2, just repeating that like 10 times a night at one point, trying to get the best items to drop.
And I mean, we know this feeling too, and I guess it's not the worst feeling, but this feeling where you're like really kind of getting frustrated that you've killed something over and over again. And to be fair, it's in this loop where you learn some of the most optimized, like your most optimized relationship with the mechanics happen, right? When you do something like kill a boss over and over and over again, trying to get a particular loot drop. At the same time, we know that there's an icky, crappy feeling that's connected with it once it's more than you want. And there's also this other horrible thing where you can't stop till that drop happens. And that next thing you know, it's 3:30 in the morning, your eyes are bloodshot, you have this icky, unhealthy feeling in your body, the thing drops, and you're not even really excited that it dropped. You're just thankful that you've been released.
Yeah. And again, like, we'll be here for another 5 hours if we don't start to wrap things up. And
yes,
like, loot design is such a very fascinating thing. And I guess my final point then, like, as like Highlander's talking about in chat, there's a very narrow line you have to walk in terms of good loot generation. It's gotta be random enough to keep the player guessing, but it still needs to be impactful or spiky enough for them to understand, hey, this new sword that shoots lasers, or my shield that turns enemies into monkeys if I get a critical block, that it changes how I approach this game. And like we said, like, the line between good and bad ARPGs is very wide in this aspect, and it's hard to, I think, comprehend it if you aren't well versed in this genre. Again, like, we've rattled off like 6-7 different ARPGs over the course of this stream, and they are completely different in terms of their approach. And if you're just kind of approaching from a consumer standpoint or not understanding the design, it's not going to make sense to you. You know, how is Grim Dawn different from Diablo? You're clicking on a map and watching enemies die. But there are fundamental differences in how these games are set up that it's both fascinating and it's incredibly daunting if you're trying to build something to capture that magic.
Fully agree with that statement. Yeah, I think it's something just inherently cool about the games industry in general, is that some of these genres have reached these outrageous levels of depth and complexity, and they still hold up, right? There are people like us that can play those games for hundreds of hours and have all these interesting things to say about them. It takes more than those hundreds of hours to build something that you can do that with. It's crazy. Yes. Love it.
No, any developer can make Diablo in like 2 hours, right? I mean, it's a very simple thing. I mean, why haven't they released Diablo 4? They did that trailer, like 5 months ago? It should be out by now.
To be fair, on one side we can say Blizzard develops slowly. On the other side, it's because they're not going to put something out unless it meets the needs of their audience. And that's why, I mean, I think we have seen many times in history, and I think we will continue to see, that Blizzard is the definitive kind of mainstream developer. And I don't mean that in the way that everybody loves Justin Bieber, in that they bring us all together by finding the intersection that a wide range of disparate players all share. And so I think that they are still by far the experts kind of on that front of any of those studios out there.
Yeah. All right, but with that, now you got me interested in Destiny. We'll have to consider maybe, is it free to play now?
Yeah, you can get a lot of play out of it for free.
All right.
And playing it can be inexpensive too, even if you do some amount of paying. I think at some point I'll do some brushing up on Warframe, and we should do a conversation about that at some point, because that is still special and different.
Yeah.
They're off in their weird principality of insane loot crack.
Mm-hmm. And definitely check out Victor Vran. It's such a flip on traditional ARPG design that it kind of like threw me for a loop when I played it. It's not the best ARPG, but it's so different that I ended up really appreciating it. And
Awesome.
I still need to play. I'm debating just buying the last Epoch and just seeing what they're doing in terms of ARPG design, because I'm hearing
EPOCH?
EPOCH. Yes, is it the last Epoch or the Lost Epoch? Now let's see. What was it?
Yeah, last Epoch.
Last. Okay. Yep, that's the one. 'Cause I've been hearing good things about it, but I don't know what that one is, how that one is playing out. It looks like they're going for something similar to Titan Quest, in that you don't have a class per se, you have your masteries, and then they kind of like let you build your class.
Dude, the mastery class diagram is very attractive, and it does have 1,597 reviews, and it is very positive at 82% positive. That's sounds good so far.
Yeah, and Wolken is at 50,000 reviews, but they are all mixed right now.
Yikes! I mean, that's the thing is when I originally was looking at Wolken, I really, it's so beautiful, and that sometimes when things are so beautiful, it makes me nervous.
Mm.
And I don't mean that as, I don't even know what I mean by that. It's just like my life, the history of playing games and seeing certain signs. Because man, that the Steam screenshot of that, like that giant multi-armed monster with the eyes, and it's all super cool looking.
Yeah, and that again, like expectations and getting about these games. That's another like 4 or 5 topics easily.
Yeah.
But before we just start rambling on for another hour, I think we will end things here. So, Tomo, again, it has been a pleasure hanging out with you. We're going to shoot for doing our round table. I believe that is the 23rd this month. And if you have free time next month, again, we can either talk about this or we'll pick another topic that we can certainly ramble on for at least a good hour and a half. So,
for sure.
And I'm
excited about the roundtable. It'll be cool.
So for people tuning in, I'm going to leave this up, so it should go up on the channel, The Second Son Encoding. But for people to follow you or what you're currently working on, what are the best places?
So you can find us at Epic Tavern on Twitch and discord.gg/Epic Tavern on Discord. We have a game called Epic Tavern on Steam that's in early access presently. That's a very rich storytelling game, as well as one where you manage a tavern, so you kind of get to know the adventurers over drinks and then send them out on quests. And I guess that's it. Oh, and the studio is called Hyperkinetic Studios.
All right. And for those of you who want to follow me, again, you can follow me on Twitter at GWBicer. We have our Discord and Patreon link down below. Epic Tavern has its own Discord, right?
Yes. Like I said, discord.gg/Epic Tavern. We love talking about storytelling. We love talking about video game industry. I love talking about game design.
All right. So, with that said, we're going to wrap things up here. I'll be back later tonight for our regular game streams. Check out our upcoming roundtable. And again, Tomo, I'm sure we're going to be chatting beyond the roundtable again real soon.
For sure. It was great. It was great being here, and thanks for having me.
All right. Everybody, have a great rest of your Thursday evening, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we some of the art and science of games. Have a great rest of your night, and talk to you later.